Thanks all for being here. My name is Leah, and so I'm going to be presenting on my senior thesis research. I actually just graduated from Harvard College in May. Don't currently work in academia, but maybe I'll find my way back, but was encouraged to submit to this conference. This is actually my first time presenting at an academic conference, so really excited about the opportunity. But my advisors were Katie Garrow and Elena Glassman, both at Harvard Seas and both working in HCI, so it's been quite the pleasure to work with them over the last more than a year now on this research. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about my project called Syntaktis, a large language model-backed editing interface for supporting ethical journalism practices. And first, I just want to give some more context for why this is something I'm interested in, this combination of journalism, computation, and ethics. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So I actually served as one of the news chairs of the Harvard Crimson over over my senior year and parts of my junior year as well. I reported for 2.5 years as well, so I was very involved in the newsroom at Harvard, and our newsroom was extremely active. We had staff across the entire organization of hundreds. Our newsroom itself was around 100 people. And as an editor, I spent basically every weeknight there from around 8 p.m. until 2 or 3 a.m. producing the paper. We're the only breakfast table daily in Cambridge, and this was a huge part of my life. So I also studied CS, and I was like, how are there ways to combine these two things? And one thing I was very interested in is how we produce coverage that's ethical and portrays our communities effectively and fairly. And I think this is especially acute when you are reporting on a school that you also go to. And the Crimson got in trouble for this all the time. Sometimes I disagreed with why we were getting in trouble or criticized. One big controversy was in 2019. We were condemned for our coverage of an ICE rally because we named a speaker who was speaking in a public location. This made its way into the New York Times. We were actually boycotted for more than a year by a lot of the diversity groups on campus. I was reporting on it at the time. I was a freshman. I was like, why aren't these people talking to me? And then quickly learned about the history there. In the last year, we've been accused of both being biased against Israel and also being biased against Palestine. And on a lighter note, we've also been criticized for not reaching out to enough psychiatrists about our psychedelics coverage at one point. So all this to say, I think ethics are super important to maintaining the trust of people that you're reporting on. And it was something that was super important to me in thinking about, are there ways that we can use computation to do this? And I think that's a super interesting question because we think of ethics as like kind of beyond that. It's like an acutely human thing, but also I think that there are potentially for me, it was interesting to see, are there any ways that we can actually make this more efficient? Especially for people who are super sleep deprived, who are working in newsrooms super late, that are often understaffed, which also mimics a lot of the problems facing local journalism, where you have very small staffs, and you have oftentimes like the managing editor is also writing all the stories, is intended to look over all their own work, and it's hard to do that in a fair way when you're the one writing it. So that was kind of part of the motivation. I'll get more into the paper. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So my paper basically looked at if we can use LLMs in any way to in this editorial process, but specifically for looking at these ethical questions. So things like, I'll get more into this later, but things like asking for comment when you can give anonymity, detecting bias, and things like that. And again, inspired by my own experiences, but also by kind of interviews I did with others about fears about being replaced by computers and local newsrooms shuttering and things like that, where I was trying to figure out, are there ways that we can maintain the agency of reporters, but also make their work more ethical and fair? And then as a kind of broader tangent, can this improve trust in journalism at large, especially in the US, where we have so much political polarization and concerns about the state of journalism and whether we can still trust what we read and whether we can trust reporters. So that kind of motivated these two research questions, which I focused on. One, if we can just reduce ethical journalism oversights, which again I'll get into because it's so hard to define that, but also whether it can fit into existing editorial processes without replacing people, and then avoid taking away the agency of reporters and basically help them to feel authentic about their work. So I don't know if there's a way to make it a little bit like darker, because I feel like some of the colors aren't showing up, but I think it should be fine as long as everyone can still see everything. But basically, just to get into a little bit of the related work and background, 3 things I kind of focused on when I was looking at this field. But first, I was obviously very motivated by HCI practices, looked at human AI collaborative writing, So there's a lot on how we can kind of effectively deploy language models for parts of the writing process, and that gets into really kind of nitty gritty, like think about like Grammarly, where you're literally looking at sentence structures and how you can replace specific things. And I took a lot of inspiration from their interface as well, but also how we keep humans in the loop. And there's kind of broader questions as well about whether we can use AIs for kind of creative ideation and storytelling and things like that, which I thought was really interesting as I was reading. Computational journalism as well, obviously very in line with a lot of the work here. Looked a lot of Nick Teichholtz's work as well, which I think he's here presenting in another room, so super, super cool to be around these people. But there's a lot of tools for investigative journalism that I think are really interesting for data scraping, things like that. And there's also a lot of kind of private money, investment money, and startups that are interested in computational journalism. I think it's like a hot topic right now. And then outside of kind of the realm of kind of computation HCI, I looked at just kind of ethical journalism and studies about that. One, like how do we define that? Questions about like what are like ethical codes and how do we use them? There have been some research and studies that show that ethical codes aren't actually that effective in kind of motivating behavior of journalists, and they just basically don't really think about it or don't really care. So that was another thing that was on my mind as I was reading and trying to get familiar with this. But I think there's been very little research about whether we can kind of combine ethics and journalism and computation specifically, and that's why it was something I was super interested in. So this gets more into kind of the different, how I was defining ethics, and I'm sure some of the journalists in the room would know, like Society of Professional Journalists. That's the kind of broadest U.S.-based journalism organization dedicated to like free speech and journalism and high standards for ethical behavior. And we kind of parsed through its ethical code and tried to break it down into something that could be digested potentially by an LLM and something that we could use in prompting and fine-tuning and whatnot. And basically came up with 7 buckets, and we know that they're not perfect. We think that there's room for improvement. It's something we've been thinking about, but tried to come up with somewhat discrete buckets on how we can things that are specific to like writing. So not like, I think there's one thing in the SPJ code that's like keep promises to sources or don't make promises to sources, but if you do, like keep them. And obviously that's not something that we can put into an interface, or maybe not currently. But yeah, I think that there's inherently some arbitrary nature of this because it is like we pick this specific code, but we try to pick the most broad one. And to go into the system overview a bit, we basically, I think it'll help to just like skip to the actual kind of images and video itself. Basically feed in an article, it will annotate it and mark it up. Has some, using kind of the OpenAI GPT-4 at the time. Obviously, there's more advanced models now that we've kind of flirted with updating too. And yeah, so this is a bit of the overview and how it looks. This is kind of, I'll show a video in a second. This is trying to show like the step-by-step process, but basically it'll underline a sentence that it's concerned about, and then kind of show this box on the side and the panel. This one's like did not obtain comment. It'll have a revision that usually in a gray box, but it's a bit hard to see on this screen, I know. And you can kind of click to insert it and things like that. The revision is obviously generated by the LLM, so that was something we were thinking about and being basically very concerned about hallucinations. We saw some interesting behavior there, which I'll get into. And that was kind of the sentence level, like, oh, we're underlying specific sentences and trying to keep them in line with this, with these specific categories. And then we also had different kind of word identifications. So we looked basically if we thought words were sensational or biased, and we also knew there was some kind of blurring of the lines there, but we wanted to basically figure out if we could provide different alternatives for people and if that would be helpful for them in their editorial processes. And let's see if I can get this video to play. But I won't play for too long because I know I don't want to take up too much time. But this is basically just how it works. You can kind of click through it. There's a side panel off to the right, and then you can click around with it. You can actually edit into this box itself, so you can think of it kind of like I don't know what other newsrooms use. I know we use Google Drive, but there's various other word processors that people use. But the idea is you can also like bold and italicize and other things like that into the interface. So yeah, I will go to the next slide. Let's see. Sorry, I think it's not letting me stop this video. Okay, there we Awesome. So basically then we wanted to go to how do we evaluate the system and think about if we like it, if we think it works, or if it's useful at all. So first we did kind of a technical evaluation. First we were thinking about experts, and I think that a lot of the user studies, which you'll see, were done with student journalists. So we were thinking about how would an expert actually evaluate the output here. And this was less about the interface. We actually didn't show them the interface at all. We didn't want that to mess with them. We didn't tell them that it was generated by an LLM because we know there are a lot of inherent biases, and rightly so, about the use of LLMs for journalism. And basically had editors with decades of experience to evaluate kind of different edits that were provided by the system, and basically say if they agreed with them or disagreed with them or why. And they generally, for the most part, agreed with many of the sentence level edits. There was a wider variety of the word level edits, just because I think there was more, I don't know, the system was more kind of sensitive there, and it would often highlight words that were maybe sensitive or biased or sensationalist in some contexts, but not others. So I think that was an interesting kind of variety to see. And then we also did some studies where we basically fabricated articles and planted potential errors in them, and then saw if our system could identify them over a number of trials. And it did pretty well with that, but I think there were some kind of differences there we can also get into, where it would maybe highlight in one area and not in another, so it was hard to compare overall. But I think the user study for us was more interesting to think about whether this would actually be something that would be used in a newsroom. So I had a lot of access to student journalists because of my role in the Crimson, so did some studies with a bunch of journalists from the Crimson, also did studies with journalists from other newsrooms across the nation, and ended up basically having them bring in articles. We asked them to bring in articles that were addressing kind of more sensitive topics, so we would ask them for like protests. I think this was a good time to do the study because there were a lot of protests about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, that brought up really heated issues where people had to be extremely sensitive about how they were reporting. So it was actually less difficult to find content than we were worried about. And I think in an ideal world, we would have had them bring in 2 articles that they were working on that were in draft form, and then had them edit one with our system and one without. Usually that's actually very rare for journalists because they're working with such high frequency, and they're usually going to upload it before that. So we had them bring in one article they were working on. We split the article in half, which worked better in some situations than others. Some articles are very short, so it's hard to do it, and then we would have to not use those studies. But articles that were, I don't know, more than 500 words, it worked pretty well, where we could split it in half and have them look at half of it with our system support and have them evaluate it there, and then look at half of it without system support. And we would have them we do kind of a semi-structured interview where we ask them to talk about different kind of ethical concerns that they thought their editors might bring up, or things like that, or things that they had thought about more when they were writing the article. And getting into the results, we found some really interesting results. People basically said that they were really interested in using the system. A lot of them actually had never used LLMs before, and they were really surprised that they could do this. They were surprised by the capabilities. I think an interesting phenomenon we noted was that many distrusted AI less after using our tool. We asked them the same question about their level of trust before and after the study, and the level of trust went up dramatically, even among people who didn't find the tool particularly useful for their specific article. I think that just seeing it in action made them potentially alleviated some fears. And I think that we were really excited about the fact that people didn't feel like it was taken away from their agency. I think this participant 5 quote, it gave me suggestions. It's not like it forced me to change my article. I was totally in control. Something that we were really excited about. I think we were also interested in this potential training aspect. We didn't really evaluate the pedagogical implications too much in the study, but we think it could be interesting to think about whether we can use this to train novice journalists, and whether that would be an interesting use case. And yeah, so I think in terms of just wrapping things up and putting a bow on it, I think that we came away from the studies really interested in whether we can trust AIs with more kind of potentially sensitive tasks. I think we think about ethics as something that's so delicate, and obviously it has huge implications, as talked about with the Crimson example. But we were thinking about ways that we can use it as kind of more like a second pair of eyes, rather than replacing a human in a human editor. We think we kind of came up with this little diagram of where Syntaktis could fit into existing editorial processes, and we think that it could help people. It could kind of save a lot of time for newsrooms. It could save a lot of time for editors, but also add to their efficiency. And we still think that there are lots of concerns. I think, especially around feeding data into LLMs about accuracy and hallucinations, job security, and whatnot. So we think that there's there's a lot of kind of education to be done and more work, but overall I think we're really excited about this research and continue to see it as like a proof of concept that we think could have implications for journalists. So yeah, thank you. I'm not at Harvard anymore, but definitely email me. My email's live until June, and my personal email's there as well.
I'm Biehle. I graduated from UC San Diego in 2022, and this was actually research I was doing in my undergrad, and then since that I've been working in industry, and then recently came back to finish the paper. Now I work in like UX product design for Google search, so it has some tangential relation to news in terms of how people processing data, how are they looking for things, and then it also relates to some of this participatory journalism, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the paper is called Participatory Journalism, Stakeholder Perspectives on Enhancing Online Discussion Through Data Talk. It's by me, Biehle, Ritvik Irigaretti, Lou Sun, and Professor Stephen Dow. And this was done in the UCSD Design Lab, and that's specifically the Proto Lab. So with Web 2.0, participatory journalism was a means in which to involve audience members within the news cycle. This is analyzing, reporting, collecting, sharing this data. I think a really interesting example of this is in the January 6th event. There was a project done where they took a bunch of video from that day and they compiled it into one sequential project where you can actually see all of these different perspectives and kind of get the play-by-play throughout the entire event. Another trend is, so comment sections are a way to facilitate discussions online. Many of you have probably noticed that they have been reduced over time, and this is for a variety of reasons, including toxicity, misinformation, and then overall a lack of moderation in these comment sections. And then some news sites have even gone as far as to just close them outright. Another trend is the use of data and data visualization in news. This makes sense because it's producing this empirical evidence for these stories. It's increasing trustworthiness and validity of what's being said. This increase is in part because of the proliferation of open data sets and then improvement of tools in terms of data wrangling and building the visualizations. So to give a little bit of context, this census paper, I think it was back in 2008, it's essentially the blueprint for this collaboration and discussion related to visualizations. They created a visualization with enhanced features where you could share, annotate directly on the visualization, and then this created a sort of async social space. A couple of years after that, the comment space created a system in which you could link and tag directly on visualizations, and then this was useful for, in a discussion forum, you're able to reference that data directly, and this was really helpful for collaborative data analysis. But what's interesting about both of these is these seem like interesting systems, but there was no evidence of any real-world integration. So the Data Talk paper from a couple of years ago, I think it was 2020, they were interested in looking into these types of comments that are referencing these visualizations directly. It's called Data Talk, and they went to a bunch of news sites, specifically articles that had these data visualizations, and then analyzed the comments to see how many of them were participating in this data talk. From the ones that they saw, they found that the contributions were really meaningful, very valuable, but it actually only occurred in 2.4% of all comments, which is really low. So that led us to ask these key research questions in terms of what are these challenges for supporting data talk on these current news websites, and then looking more into the future, what are the perceived benefits and barriers for creating an interactive news platform that scaffolds this data talk. So for our methodology, we built a design probe, and then we plan to conduct some stakeholder interviews. For the design probe, it's a Figma prototype that was based on a real San Diego Union Tribune article, and we created an enhanced version. So we moved the comment section, which is typically at the very bottom of the page. We moved it so it's actually adjacent to the visualization. It's more towards the top of the page. And then we added 3 key enhanced features, which includes the data Q&A, data views, and data stories. So each of these features is in relation to a specific scenario that we were interested in looking into. So the first one being questioning the data. As you can see here, one of the audience members is able to see a point in the graph where they're seeing this uptick, and so they're able to put a question mark and ask a question saying, oh, I see that the graph is increasing. What is a possible reason for that? And then it creates a thread in which other people can actually reply directly to that comment and they can get an answer. Another feature is the data views. So this is the adding data views scenario. If you are someone who maybe you've seen other visualizations that are related to the topic, you're able to actually submit those to be reviewed. Or maybe you're a data analyst yourself and you want to bring a new perspective to the visualization that already exists, you're able to submit that, and then it creates a carousel where the other audience members are able to cycle through these different visualizations. And then the third one is data stories. This is for, even if you don't have some substantial contribution, or maybe you don't have a question, you're able to tell a story that's related to the data. This makes it a more personable experience, it's more relatable, and it also allows for building of community. So you can see here, this is a graph related to COVID. So this user's commenting about how their family got COVID during this time, kind of their experience, and other people are able to reply and relate to that. So the stakeholders we talked to, there was 4 key groups. It was journalists, data scientists, readers, and moderators. You can see a little bit of their information there. And then for the interviews, we had 12 qualitative interviews. It was 3 per stakeholder. And then the structure was roughly 45 minutes, maybe a little bit closer to an hour. And we split it into 2 phases. The first phase was talking about their current practices, really focusing on what their day-to-day is looking at, their specific occupation and role in the data pipeline. I don't know why that's happening. And then phase 2 was we showed them the design probe, had them interact with it, and then they gave some of their reactions and thoughts into the potential integration of a system like this. And then looking at the data, we did qualitative open coding towards those 2 research questions. So one of the biggest challenges that we found was the speed of this news cycle. Data scientists sometimes only have a 24-hour turnaround to build these visualizations that would be robust enough to facilitate this data talk. Journalists need to quickly move on to the next story, and moderators, they don't have the time or the resources to linger in previous comment sections to make sure that everything's fact-checked and meaningful discussions happening. Data wrangling also takes a lot of resources. There's a lot of manipulation that happens when you're trying to build these data visualizations for these stories. Not only is the data wrangling, it takes a lot of time and effort, but they specifically cited there's a level of skill and expertise that's necessary that not every newsroom has. And then overall, the low quality of comments deters discussions, and this is because there's no scaffolding to create those meaningful comments at the beginning, and there's no ongoing moderation to pair out those low quality comments, which makes it not very encouraging in order to want to contribute yourself. So after we had the stakeholders interact with the data probe, they actually they were excited about the potential for using data as an entry to discussions. This is sorry. There was a lot of potential for these data discussions. Not only is it bringing value to the people that are able to focus on one specific topic, but there's also value to the audience members that are able to go back and see these threads later on. Data comments are able to inform data pipelines. I think this is very interesting because there isn't just value for these readers and audience members for this enhanced level of data discussion. By having these meaningful comments, journalists and moderators actually commented how these are able to they're able to show perspectives, questions, level of data literacy, which is actually able to have an ongoing effect towards building their next stories. How do they present that data, which creates a cycle in which there's a higher quality on both ends. And then readers actually were excited about the potential for other ways to engage, other ways to participate, rather than it being more of a black and white, am I an expert in this field and I have some meaningful contribution? There's more avenues in which these audience members are able to participate, whether it just be commenting, upvoting, telling stories, asking questions. So in conclusion, Data Talk has potential benefits for all of the stakeholders. within the journalism ecosystem, but it's still infrequently seen in current practice. And this is because of some of these notable barriers that we just identified. But it's really worth looking into because there is a lot of potential for an improved discussion system. And I just wanted to acknowledge the grant that this was under and then some of these great people that helped this research happen. And then that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm curious about Syntaktis and what your plan for it. Is there a plan to put this out there, or what do you see as a next step?
Yeah, the current, I don't know if I work, hopefully I work here. Currently I haven't worked on it a ton since graduation or since my thesis deadline, honestly, but I think it's something I would like to return to. Like, I think it's interesting, and I don't know, like every day there's so many new AI developments and updated models and whatnot, so I think it'd be interesting to revisit at some point, and it's something I've been asked, but if it were to go out there in any form, it wouldn't be monetized or anything. Like, I don't think that's the motivation of this, so yeah.
Also a question for you, Leah.
Yeah.
Very impressed by your project.
Thank you.
So several questions. Which LLM did you use?
Yeah.
Did you build this alone? And is it still functional?
Yeah. So I used like the GPT-4 0125 preview, whatever, the one that was in February, I think. And it's still, yeah, it is still functional. It's not hosted right now, but I could just turn it on. It's functional. And I did build it alone with advice along the way from my advisors. Yeah.
So kind of a related question, is it open source?
No, but it could be. Like, I could just make the GitHub public, yeah.
So related, so I work at Boston University. We have this experiential learning program called Spark. And we've actually been working for a couple of years on a very similar tool, sort of. But it's more about kind of the ethics of reporting, like by coverage area. So like, are you doing more reports? If you were there, right, you probably know Boston pretty well. But like, are you doing enough stories about Roxbury versus Beacon Hub, right? And so kind of in a similar vein, and we'll actually be talking about it in a talk tomorrow. So would love to see some more collaboration.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But it's the audience and participation one. No, that's this one. But Brooke Williams is my partner in crime on the class.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll save down the link.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really curious about the tools for that. I'm wondering precisely about the ethics of the ethical concerns you have, if any, kind of like about creating this tool to sort of make ethics, or like make improve journalism ethics. Like what came up for you as you were reading it? What do you think about ethically speaking?
Yeah, I think that I was really, I don't know, I think that I am very like deeply concerned about reporters like losing their jobs and editors losing their jobs and things like that. Most of the other people I worked with on Crimson Leadership are going to journalism now, and it's like it's a very hard field to break into. Everyone knows that, but I don't know. I think I'd be very concerned if this tool were used in any way to replace someone or to cut someone out of a work stream. I'd be worried about if humans weren't the ones using the tool, if it was just like something you passed it through before it got uploaded or something like that, which I don't think it would come to anytime soon. But yeah, I think generally, I don't know, like obviously anytime you're using LLMs, like hallucinations are involved, whether or not that detracts from the accuracy of articles. And I think that the intention of my work wasn't really to change accuracy, it was more to make people more thoughtful about how they were writing. And there was some interesting behavior where like hallucinations sometimes made people realize that something they wrote wasn't how they wanted to phrase it, or like it just like sparked some inspiration with them with a hallucination. So I think there's still some kind of interesting, behavior potential there. But yeah, I think the main thing I'm worried about is taking away, like hurting journalists more than helping them through this tool and making it into like a cost-cutting mechanism.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I take a different approach to answering the same question? We've been working on another project that is actually about trying to enhance small newsrooms, where you can't necessarily, it's a shoestring budget, very small team doing local newspapers, and we're using AI tools to kind of enhance their work, to kind of provide help with editing, for example, or maybe caption creation, things like that. And I think a tool like the one you're kind of designing, right? When you have a newspaper that's only 1 or 2 people, these tools can be really useful to basically improve the quality of their work, where they wouldn't be able to hire anyone anyway. So that's, I think, maybe a potentially different perspective.
John?
Oh yeah, it's Cole. Yeah, great presentation. I'm wondering in the model of engagement that you have around data talk, how like social and all the commenting that goes on in social space, and then all the commenting that goes on in what we might call dark social, which is email. People are emailing chargegraphs constantly and commenting on them. Like, how does that all fit into like a broader, your model for engagement? Because obviously, commenting within a web browser is like, it would be really cool, but most of the actions actually happen. It's actually happening. It's just over on X or Blue Sky or Insta or wherever. So how do you see that, and what's the unique value then of web browser-based comment?
That's a great question. So the unique value and the reason we were focused on news sites, and it goes back into why they were removing them. It wasn't just to try to bring down misinformation. It was actually because in news sites, maybe because they're older, there's more attribution between the people that are commenting and the actual news source. So if you're on a news website and there's a lot of negative comments, this was being perceived as negative towards that article, which is a big reason that they scaled it back, which is also why we decided to focus on kind of putting that pressure on the news site to build up a more positive community, because there is that kind of pressure going on. It's a great question, because the dream would be, and I think it exists on, for example, I think YouTube has some way in which you can comment on specific frames, and that kind of goes into the same thing. But it's not on the same level of those types of comments. I feel like they're more individual contributions rather than bringing towards some type of network. And I think these news sites have more of a reason to try to supply good information to the community. So they might be more willing to adapt to this.
When we ran this conference 3 years ago, we used a platform called OEA. I don't know.
I've never heard of that.
But so some Snapchat engineers, Mark Hansen at Columbia knows, built this in beta, and we used it actually for the conference. And it was wonderful, and people would literally wander into rooms. It was almost like a VR XR kind of thing.
Oh, cool.
And comment on things.
Yeah.
But it was in real time, and it was a video XR kind of thing. And I was just thinking, if you released a cool new database, it would be very future leaning, but it'd be really cool to have kind of people wander in and actually in that kind of way engage. It's not as durable as a permanent comment, but anyway, just thinking out loud.
That is really interesting. My biggest concern is that the reason I think this research is relevant, and a big reason I want to finish it, is because I think as time goes on, a lot of people have given up on these comment sections, and being able to say I can actually play a role into making this article specifically more engaging and help support the community as time goes on, and just more comment sections are removed. And with the increase of data visualization, we're actually in a great time to try to revitalize that. So.
The Crimson actually just took down its comment section
there
last
you
year
go.
but I think it was more that we just had a moderation issue, as you were mentioning. We couldn't moderate it, and it was falling to the president, and then we would get all these spam comments. So I feel like a lot of the discussion now has moved to Twitter, and people kind of talk about articles there instead.
Yeah.
One hand up here. I have a question for the engagement tool. You may have explained this in the presentation, so I apologize if I missed it. But when you ran the LLM to do some of the editing, did you notice patterns of what it tends to omit more often than not? Were there patterns before you even prompted it or you created guardrails that you noticed that it tended to change, edit? Did it have its own bias?
Yeah, that's a super good question. I think we noticed some really, I don't think I put it in my submission for this conference because it's only 5 pages, but in my thesis we noticed some really interesting, strange behavior around. So one thing that we did that I don't think I talked about in this paper was we evaluated headlines, because we think headlines are really an area where there's a lot of potential sensationalism, and people try to I don't know, you have to get people to click on your article, so we think that was something we were worried about or something to focus on. So for headlines, we found out that like putting specific words into headlines would make the system reject it like way more often than others. So any headline that mentioned, like I think we tried like using the word like transgender, even if it wasn't in like any like sensational context or biased context, like that would cause its approval to go down like a lot. It would go from like whatever 80 or 90% to like 20% when we ran it on a bunch of trials. So I think that was really interesting behavior, and we like didn't explore it too much. It was kind of like a tangent of, oh, this is weird. Why is this happening? I think I obviously wouldn't pull it up now, but I think there's like kind of a scale of kind of ethical considerations on the ones that we were looking at, and like something like omitting comment I think is pretty kind of, it's either like you did it or not. It's pretty straightforward to look for, and there's like very specific structures that journalists use to indicate or include comment. But other things like I don't know, like belief stated as fact or something like that, like it's a bit more nebulous where if that's happened or where that fits in. So that's things that would be omitted more often. Is because like, but I think that's part of it is that's also consistent with like what a normal human editor would also think. I don't know if I said this during my presentation, but like a lot of times the editors that we hired to look at the output for the technical evaluation, like they also disagreed with each other, and I think it just shows like there's not always like one objective truth in this, and if it's hard for human editors to do it, then it's hard to expect a computer to be perfect, and maybe we shouldn't necessarily like hold them to the same standards as a computer or a human editor. Yeah.
Okay, great. Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Another one for you, Leah.
Yep.
So those proposals to change a word or something, this doesn't have an effect about how editors then or journalists then handle in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Do they learn something?
Yeah.
While using the tool?
Like I think if we were going to do more, if we were going to expand the research, or that would be like the one thing that we are really interested in, is like whether it has a pedagogical effect and helps journalists down the line. So if we could, I don't know, do a follow-up study later with them or something like that. Like I think that would be really interesting. And obviously we do like an exit survey where we ask them if they learned something or whatever, but it's really hard. Like it's one thing to just like mark something on a scale whether or not you learned versus like actually being able to evaluate that. So I think being able to tell if there's some kind of pedagogical impact would be really powerful. So I think that's something we're really interested in, and I know Professor Glassman was interested in as well.
Okay, fantastic. Very good conversation here in this room. Thank you very much.